Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar titled Cross-Border Payments, Disrupting a $1 Trillion Industry. Special thanks to the panelists for taking the time to share their thoughts with us today and the Bottomline for sponsoring the webinar. Now, there's never been a more exciting time to be in cross-border payments, whether you're looking at central bank-backed digital currencies that are promising to reshape the way we do cross-border payments to well-funded fintechs gunning to drive efficiency and user experience, or even payment networks and banks alike modernizing the technology infrastructure. There's so much to be discussed in terms of what the future of the industry is. Joining us today to have this very exciting discussion, we have right on top there Andrew McCormack, who is the center head for Singapore Innovation Hub for the Bank for International Settlements. Below Andrew, we have Atul Bhuchar, who is the Group Payments Head for Global Transaction Services in DBS Bank. Below him, we have Venkatesh Saha, who is the Head of APAC Expansion for WISE. And last but not least, we have Shoshani, the Head of APAC for Bottomline. Gentlemen, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us. Great to have you all. So why don't we begin by looking at some of the broader trends of things? And, Andrew, BIS, I'm sure you guys do a lot of research in this area. You do a lot of pilot projects and whatnot. So maybe we'll start off with you. Why don't you walk us through what are some of the biggest trends that you're seeing within the cross-border payment space right now?
Sure, Vision. Thanks so much. And great to be here with all you guys. Obviously, I think cross-border payments are having a bit of a renaissance moment, and the 2020s are shaping up to be a very transformative decade, I guess, in how money moves around the globe. Zooming out and back 20 years, I think you'd seen consistent and increased investment in digital disruption. From the likes of fintechs like Wise, the advent of digital banks like DBS that are very kind of modern in their technology strategy and approach. And I think all of that combines to say that. And I should also add the introduction of instant payments infrastructures around the world, which are fundamentally transformative, I believe, in terms of how money moves domestically. So I think all of that combines to sort of really say that consumers are expecting more in the 20s. They want always on, they want convenient, they want cheap, and they want fast payments, and certainly that's what we at the BIS, the CPMI, and the FSB also agree with. And in that, we've been working with the G20 for the past few years to define what we call the cross-border payments roadmap. And we're working with industry to achieve those kinds of outcomes, that we believe would have widespread benefits for economies and citizens around the world. So that program, is certainly underway, and many of the participants on this call are also part of that exercise as well. From here in Singapore, our team has been kind of looking at it from two perspectives. We've done a piece on interconnecting fast payments infrastructure called Project Nexus, which kind of describes a base protocol that would allow instant payments infrastructure to basically communicate with each other, standardize those APIs, and help kind of set up some of the processes that would alleviate a lot of the frictions associated with cross-border payments, specifically issues around data sharing, sanction screening, confirmation of payee, kind of all the stuff that no one thinks about, but really actually ultimately can cause a lot of friction as all the participants try to comply with the regulations around AML and CFT for a cross-border payment, so anti-money laundering. And there's really just a lot of plumbing that needs to be set up and improved in terms of doing real-time assessments on sanctions and confirming, that you're paying the correct person, for example, as you send a cross-border payment. But anyway, so we've looked at it from that perspective, which is kind of layering into the traditional, let's say, instant payments infrastructures. And then, of course, we're also looking at the central bank digital currency landscape very deeply as well through projects like Project Dunbar and many other projects around the BIS Innovation Hub and more broadly the work from the BIS into this kind of very hot topic of central bank digital currencies. But I'll stop there.
Certainly, we're having a renaissance moment for cross-border payments, and I think since you guys have set up in 2019 in Singapore, you've been kept really busy with Dunbar and Nexus. That's something that we want to dive a little bit into later as we go along with the session. Thank you for that, Andrew. Let's move on to Atul. And Atul, certainly DBS is one of those digital leaders within the banking space in this part of the world, and with yourself being focused more on the business side of things, I would like to hear what your thoughts are on the biggest trends within the cross-border space right now. You have the floor, Atul.
Thanks, Vincent. Great to be here. So, just like Andrew and yourself mentioned, the payments landscape is transforming rapidly. I mean, the kind of pace of change, if you look back, in the last 3, 5 years, maybe a decade or a few decades ahead, it's kind of mind-boggling. But is that the same pace at which maybe a Moore's law in the tech sector, at which the pace of computing doubles? Is it the same? Not yet. So if you look at a few drivers of change, it's new technologies. You talked about blockchain. We've got APIs. You've got intelligent process automation. We've got 5G or IoT. So that's one driver. The government agendas, whether it's in Asia, smart nation, smart banking, cashless economy is key. Then regulations, and if I may say also deregulations, clearly is another driver. Our customers, the business models are evolving, the consumer behavior is changing, not just for consumers, even for businesses, and obviously participants. Not to forget COVID, we say that it's now AC and BC, before COVID and after COVID. So there's a very relevant Chinese proverb I read: when winds of change blow, some people build walls and some others build windmills. And it's about, yeah, what are you building when these winds of change are blowing? So you talked about. Let me maybe just focus on three quick, trends in terms of payments. It's what we call typically 3I, which is the instant, intelligent, integrated payments. It also happens to be a cornerstone of the payment strategy on the institutional side. So instant, Andrew talked about. It's about the whole instant 24/7 becoming real across markets, and clearly in Asia, whether you look at Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, India. It's actually a movement which is now being executed over the last few years. But it's not just about instant 24/7. Now that's a given. When you do an internet search, you don't check. Is it a weekend? Is it midnight? You just do a Google search and you get an answer, and that's what consumer expectations are. But the other interesting aspect is about having standardized QR codes. It's about actually being able to have proxy addresses. You need to remember a 10 or a 15-digit account number, or can you do it based on alias? And also things like, Benny validation. Can you validate whether, the beneficiary account actually exists? The adopters really on this has been B2C, and then it's moved on to government to consumer, government to business, and then eventually B2B. So that's one. Quickly moving on to intelligent payments. One of my personal favorites is DBS Treasury Prism. In case it's a free to use platform, so in case you haven't used, I would always encourage the audience to check it out. So it's a platform where we actually, it was the world's first for online simulation and advisory for cash and treasury. And basically, what it does is, our customers tell us how to do cash management, how to manage the liquidity across 20 markets worldwide. We give them optimized solutions with different scores, and we overlay that with regulatory and tax information across markets. So it's actually moving beyond transactional into the so-called advisory mode. Then if you look at regulations, FX advisory, that's another area where these rules are complex, they're dynamic, and really that's where customers are looking for their advice. And lastly is also about auto execute across multiple payment rails. Most markets now have a plethora of payment rails, and for customers to really be able to identify which rail do I really want to use is complex. So they just want to say that I want my payment anytime, anywhere, and just let the bank decide which rail to use. And the third trend I would just quickly talk about really is integrated payments, and that's about really getting embedded into whether it's ecosystems, vertical or horizontal, embedded into platforms. It's about really the customer experience of how you make it invisible, make it simple, make it predictive, and even on the business side is ERP platforms, accounting systems, and it's also about leveraging on data. At the end of the day, it's a simple thing like if you've taken a travel insurance, if the flight gets delayed, can that information come to the insurance provider, and can they automatically get a reimbursement to you instead of waiting for the consumer to lodge a claim? Yep. I'll just pause there. Back to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Atul. And I think you brought up some really good points over there about how the trends are shifting. I mean, expectations are being shaped by the internet economy. But it's not just the internet economy, right? Domestic payments are also highly efficient. Like Andrew is mentioning about the instant real-time payments. So a lot of consumers and businesses are also expecting that amount of frictionless experience with cross-border payments as well. And certainly that's shaping a lot of the expectations. Thank you for sharing your views. Let's move on to Venkat. Venkat, from your point of view of Wise that's trying to disrupt the market right now, what are some of the biggest trends that you think is shaping cross-border payments? You have the floor.
Thank you, Vincent. So Wise is a technology company that focuses on the entire continuum of foreign exchange. So sending, receiving, storing, and spending. We're 10 years old, and we're now listed on the London Stock Exchange. When I look at Asia Pacific more generally, I'd be compelled here to actually reiterate many of the things that the other speakers have said. Certainly, COVID has brought about greater digitalization, and Asia Pacific, to a certain extent, was already a fintech first part of the world. People are comfortable with transacting on their mobile phone, using wallets, and things like that. So at a time where in many countries you could not walk to your bank branch, you could not do all sorts of physical transactions that you were used to. If you could find a compelling option that was cheap, fast, reliable, had an easy to use interface, and was convenient, I think that's what became your preferred mode of transacting across the entire spectrum of financial services. And we've been a beneficiary of that, no doubt. So there is greater comfort, I think, with using financial services from the comfort of your home, from your phone, your laptop, or your office or your apartment. The second thing linked to that has been the government investment in infrastructure. So instant payment systems coming up around the world. Again, Asia Pacific here really leading the charge on that, which allows companies like us to be able to plug in either directly or indirectly. We are direct participants of FAST here in Singapore, and helps companies like us today offer more than 40% of our transactions moved from bank account in country A to bank account in country B in 20 seconds or less. And when consumers get used to these levels of service at competitive price levels, I think that then begins to set the expectation for what they expect to see across all things that they do online. The final piece for us as a non-bank and as a fintech has been a maturing of the regulatory landscape. So many regulators recognize that fintechs can add value to their economies, can offer a more compelling proposition to their customers, can bring more competition. And they are finding ways to offer licensing that is activity-based. So we regulate you if you're only doing payments. We will not impose, let's say, lending requirements on you in terms of capital and things like that. And when all of these three things are put together, it sort of sets the tone for fintechs, not just us, but many, many more to sort of come up and improve the customer journey and the customer lives.
Thank you for that. And certainly we are observing some of the things that you're saying, right? So more and more people are switching to using digital platforms to do their cross-border payments. And with the pandemic kind of shutting down branches, I am observing a lot of SMEs in Malaysia having trouble to do the remittance. And then because some of the banks don't really have eKYC. And certainly companies like Wise have benefited from that inability for them to provide this service through a digital channel. And observing your integration into Malaysia's Do It Now, I think that has also helped to make the whole transaction much faster and much more seamless for a lot of your Malaysian customers as well. So well done on that.
Thank you, Vincent. We should appoint you as a spokesperson for us. You do a much better job than I do.
I'm afraid I have to remain neutral, but thank you for that compliment. So let's move on to Eli. Eli, what are your views, from a technology provider standpoint? What do you think are some of the key things that's shaping cross-border payments right now? Sorry, Eli, you are muted. No, it happens to the best of us. Okay, go ahead, Eli. You're live. We can hear you now.
So first of all, thank you. And I would like to echo what our colleagues just spoken about the trends that are happening. And I'll just to add a few things from a service provider for the banks. The way we see things is how to provide this kind of services to the people to the new trends is how we can make it as simple as everybody mentioned. On the same time, so we need to make sure that how we make it very smart. sophisticated. People would like to see more sophisticated. And I think something that we haven't touched about it is regarding the secure. We want to have the payments to be secure. Today, by using different type of rails or different types of cross-border and the trend, we need to be more secure. We understand what's going on right now for all threats that's coming out from the various areas for frauds and what happenings for cybers attacks that we're having through the banks. So we need to make sure that whatever we do with the cross-border payments needs to be secure at the same time. As everybody mentions, it needs to be simple. Everybody used to send a message and to get the message on WhatsApp or whatever on LinkedIn and immediately get a response. And when you send a payment of $1 million, you don't know where it is and it takes time and you're not sure that it received to destination. So people expecting today to have everything says come and do it. On the same times, when we're moving from local faster payments into cross-border faster payments, we need to take into consideration quite a lot of challenges that I'm sure we're going to talk about it later on, about the challenges that they come to do. Good things is happening. So if we take, for example, of what Andrew trying to describe, for example, what happened in P27 in the Nordics, where they're building a kind of faster cross-border payments between Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, where they do different currencies and be able to connect into SEPA. I think this is the area that's where we need to think that's how we connect faster payments locally into cross-border globally, and that's what we do. And for us as a service provider, this is the area that we are focusing, where we can be able to connect the gateway, where we be able to drive these kind of messages in a more simple way, on at the same time more sophisticated way for them to do it. And don't forget how we make it in a very secure part of it.
Thank you, Eli. Certainly, the worst user experience is an experience that's not secure, right? So definitely security is a big part of it. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we would like to maybe dive a bit into the challenges, right? So let's maybe start with Andrew, then we'll follow back the same order in terms of talking about some of the challenges in creating a seamless and cost-efficient cross-border experience for the customers. So maybe Andrew, starting with you, earlier you did mention some of the issues is talking about AML compliance and all these kind of things that are really a roadblock, right? So besides that, what are some of the biggest roadblocks do you see towards a fast and cost-efficient cross-border payments ecosystem?
Sure, I can go through a few, and I'm sure others will have other pieces to add. But so again, the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure and the Financial Stability Board has published a fairly comprehensive report on the so-called frictions and challenges within cross-border, and they boiled it down to basically 7 kind of high-level categories, if you will. One would be the fragmentation and truncation of data. So different systems use different message formats, and invariably that means some sort of translation, and invariably that means some important data elements may or may not be readily accessible, or there's a lot of massaging, let's say, required to extract data. So some sort of coordination around message formats and an ability to move between one kind of ecosystem to another is a key point. 2 would be complexities in meeting compliance requirements. So again, I mentioned anti-money laundering and sanction screening. That very much relates to the point that I just mentioned, actually. Limited operating hours of capital markets and RTGS systems for settlement. So there's definitely issues in terms of time zones and the way payments flow around the world. And depending on where you are, you'll experience significant delays in certain cases, just because certain core systems or markets are not actually open for business and available. Legacy technologies remains a challenge. There's certainly a lot of digital kind of maintenance required within banks still, and certainly within market infrastructures as well. And I guess I would add into there that includes kind of capabilities around real-time account verification, real-time confirmations of payee, real-time screening services. Many of these things are done after the fact in certain payment services today, and that actually can be a source of major friction, or they're actually being done manually and by exception. And so there's definitely opportunities to automate and improve from a technology perspective. In the correspondent banking world, you do still have this multi-corridor, multi-currency model that invariably does lead to long chains of transactions and ultimately very poor user experiences, I might add. I mean, the story I like to tell is when I moved to Singapore last year and I had to send money from my Canadian bank account to my Singaporean bank account. I actually had to call my bank in Canada because there wasn't even a user interface for me to trigger the wire payment. And then 3 days later, the money showed up in my account. And we're not talking about vast sums, but just enough to live on and, pay my kids' school tuition or whatever for a month. But it was a terrible user experience. It was extremely slow. It was opaque. I had no idea when it would happen. And of course, it was actually quite expensive. It cost me something like $40 to send that payment. So definitely lots of room for improvement there. Funding costs of liquidity. So, having to pre-position liquidity in a whole bunch of different corridors and markets certainly can have an impact on the business proposition of being a provider in this space. And I'm sure Ven can talk about that. And then last but not least, I think competition. I think we've seen increased competition, which has been beneficial, but the barriers to entry still remain rather high. So from a regulatory perspective and all the reasons I just mentioned, I think there's still room for more competition to again drive towards these removing and improving the experience. Hopefully that helps.
That's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you for that, Andrew. I'm not sure if there's much space for the other speakers to add into other viewpoints, but I invite other speakers to also join in if they have any other main roadblocks they see towards a cost-efficient and a seamless cross-border payments. Anyone who would like to go can unmute their mic, and I'll bring them on stage. Atul, would you like to go? Your mic
Vincent,
is unmuted.
Andrew, very well captured. So very little for me to add, but I'll just elaborate a bit more on the regulatory part you did talk about, especially, from an Asia context, there are a large number of markets which have exchange control regulations. And it's really that last mile, which really, in terms of not just sending a payment cross-border, but also receiving the money into your own account becomes vital. So a lot of times when people, check a stopwatch and, say, how fast is the payment moving? Is it at the speed of light? These regulations really sometimes do result in friction. Now, whether it's, China, India, Indonesia, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, a lot of these markets have very unique regulations. Some cases, you need information. Some cases, you need documentation. Some cases, you need it for outgoing payments. Some cases, you need that for incoming. In some cases, required beforehand. In some cases, required post facto. So all of these, navigating this, if I may say, the complexity around this, and really to be able to have an end-to-end digital solution becomes vital. Not to kind of do a plug for DBS, but just quickly, for instance, we launched something called DigiDocs, which really was, an end-to-end. It covers the electronic banking channel. It covers the aspect of leveraging on IPA, the intelligent process automation, getting all that information into our processing platforms, and then really to interface that with the customs or the regulatory authorities. And you realize that, that true end-to-end digital journey, one is for the customer and the customer journey, and then second also for our employees as the employee journey. So that's the other interesting element, which in especially regulated markets becomes quite useful. Back to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Atul. Thanks for giving us an insight on how DBS approaches tackling some of these regulatory complexities. Venkat, Eli, anything else to add in terms of some of the challenges you see? Venkat, I see your mic is unmuted. Would you like to go? Eli, your mic is also unmuted, so maybe you'll go after Venkat.
Sure.
Venkat,
I maybe also want to add one more use case to what Andrew and Atul were talking about on regulation, which so one is, I think fintech regulation is still evolving, and it certainly has moved a lot in the right direction. But unlike in Europe, let's say, where a single license allows us to passport our services to nearly 30 countries overnight, here, the only reason I can't expand faster is that I have to be independently licensed in every jurisdiction that I go to. And often to offer the entire range of services in some markets, I need 2, 3, 4 different licenses. And in some of those markets, you can only apply for them one after the other. So you can't even do them concurrently. And That's why it generally takes sometimes up to 2 years, and it's a significant investment for any player that wants to be able to do this. The second thing, and linked to that as well, is generally around electronic KYC. So what we see here in Asia Pacific is that it's mostly solved on the consumer side. So whether it's Aadhaar in India and Mindful here in Singapore, I think there are many good examples of how you can be instantly verified so that you can then come to a digital player like us and start transacting immediately. Where we would love to see some more action is on the business side. So there are still material economies here that don't have seamless electronic verification procedures for businesses. That then tends to slow their onboarding down with companies like us, which then overall leads to a suboptimal experience and again adds to friction in the process.
Certainly, I think it's quite different in the EU where you can passport your services across the region. With ASEAN, it's a little bit more challenging, and every regulator has different degrees of comfort with players, and the maturity is different. So it's a bit of a challenge for players like Wise sometimes to really go across the market, I can imagine. But I guess that kind of barrier to entry also helps you guys to kind of establish a footprint in the market before other players come in as well. So it could be an advantage or a disadvantage depending, right? But yeah, good points you've brought up over there, Venkat. And Eli, you wanted to add something, right? Go ahead, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think if we look at it from the service provider point of view, that's where we see the kind of the challenges and where the cost effective. Just to give an example, that to move money from the UK to Vietnam, we have about 64 hops on the way to get the money coming from one side to another. Try to imagine that's to override on different regulatory, different issue, as Venkat was mentioned, and Atul about documentations and providing some more information. Think about that if we look at it from the service provider, so how we handling the issue of processing and the compliance on the issues? Where is the area that we can do some local operation times? That's everybody operate in different time zone and be able to address this kind of issue. On the same times is how we enrich the data. So we'll have more information on the message type in order for us, in order to understand more what is the transaction we're trying to do. So ISO 2022 is helping us to do it. And I'm sure later on we'll discuss a little bit more about these ones. But this is the area that's where actually is the information and the fragmentation of the data can help us to have more information and to provide it in order to do a better processing. And the last thing, and I think there's more challenging in here, and it's coming mainly from the banking side, is the legacy issue of the banks. All the banks have a different type of core bankings, the legacy systems, different format, is in the way of they make payments, and how we actually combine all these payments in order to address a kind of a worldwide standards type of things. So where as a service provider, this is the area that we're coming and trying to make it, as I said before, more simple and more smart and sophisticated for them to do it in a different way to do it.
Thank you for that, Eli. Now, certainly, we spoke a lot about some of the issues that's roadblock to, a much better cross-border payment ecosystem. Now, maybe we can look at some of the solutions, right? And like Eli mentioned, some of the things that are being worked on globally are the ISO 220 standard. We even look at a lot of CBDC projects out there. And, and Andrew, you guys are working on Project Nexus, which is quite interesting, right? You're working with the Australian Central Bank, MAS, BNM, and even the South African Central Bank to create sort of a Project Nexus. So, we do have questions coming from the floor, trying to understand, what that's all about, what kind of problems it's attempting to solve. So maybe for those who may not be so familiar with Project Nexus, can you give us a kind of a breakdown on what kind of problems you're trying to solve with this project?
Yeah, so the actually there's two different projects there. Project Nexus is really our blueprint and our vision for, it's building on the success of this Prompt Pay Now service that was introduced between Singapore and Thailand, which is really a deep, so it's
number and
yeah. So which one, I can cover both very quickly, or do you have a preference that I missed the
I think just run through both, because both are very interesting projects anyways.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we're trying to attack this from two different perspectives. One being, what can we do with the sort of traditional rails, if you will, and then what are we going to do to think about, or what can we add to this conversation on central bank digital currency? So on the first point, Project Nexus is our vision, our blueprint for interconnecting instant payment, real-time payment infrastructures that now exist in over almost 60 countries and counting. And it was really inspired by the Prompt Pay Now work that Singapore and Thailand did and that pilot project. But we said, Prompt Pay Now is great because it's a deep infrastructure connection that allows all the participants, in theory, to compete and add cross-border services to their portfolio for their clients and customers. However, inherently, a bilateral connection is not a scalable model. What we need in payments is that network effect, and we wanted to come up with kind of a base protocol vision for how instant payments infrastructure could potentially be connected. And so that's what we published, and we finished that first phase and are now looking to go into a prototype phase with some new partners. We haven't announced that yet, so that's coming up in the next month or so. Project Dunbar is very different. That's the wholesale central bank digital currency project that we announced last week with the South African Reserve Bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia, Bank Negara Malaysia, and of course the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And we're using this. We're grateful to have the participation of these central banks because they've all done for many years a lot of research and work in the central bank digital currency space. So our role at the BIS is to bring all of these kind of perspectives together, very different perspectives, very different markets. But find those common platforms. And in that case, we're really interested in what that central bank liability issued onto a common platform could bring to the table. When we look at cross-border payments, I mean, we've talked a lot about the frictions in terms of data sharing, sanction screening, and kind of that kind of validation setup for a payment. But one of the other kind of elephants in the room is the actual settlement in central bank money. And is that possible? And how can we streamline and simplify final settlement of cross-border obligations? And so that's really what a network of a multi-currency central bank digital currency network, such as what we're working on with Dunbar, could bring to the table. So I'll stop there, but just a quick overview of our work program.
Yeah, no, it's certainly very exciting and groundbreaking stuff that you guys are working on. And again, apologies on mixing up Nexus and Dunbar, but certainly very interesting projects. So maybe we can move on to Atul and just give us a sense of what do you think some of the answers to some of these roadblocks are, right? Whether it's the new messaging standards or some SWIFT initiatives or even DLT and blockchain technologies. And certainly DBS, you guys have a lot of work in these two areas as well. Atul, go ahead. You have the floor.
Thanks, Vincent. Yeah, so let me talk first about the blockchain-based payments, much closer to my heart. Though I think we continue innovating on both the so-called traditional payment rails as well as the next-gen payment rails, and both of these evolving at a fairly rapid pace. So really, for the blockchain-based payments, the question is shifted from if to when. It's no longer why; it's more about why not. There is recognition now of how these are really the building blocks of the next gen digital economy. And if you look around, in terms of really the whole asset tokenization and, which is actually across different parts of the economy, clearly all of these, so the building block role becomes important. It's a wide spectrum with let's say, the CBDCs of the central bank digital currencies at one end, then we've got the commercial bank digital currencies. Then we've got the stable coins, and then the other extreme, we really have the cryptos, and again, I don't want to enter into a comparison that itself could take an hour, but yeah, it's a very, very interesting space. And it's again important to understand, what really each of these bring to the table. Now, focusing on CBDCs, and which is what you asked about. So clearly central banks have been a catalyst. Now, if you look at just Asia, in particular, Cambodia with Project Bekong went live. Singapore, I'll come to at the end. Project Inthanon in Thailand, we've got Project Lion Rock and now Project Aurum in Hong Kong. Trials underway in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. The RBI in India has announced pilots will start in December. Even the BI in Indonesia has said they're assessing it. China, of course, with the ECNY or the DCEP, really, the trials and the scale at which they're really moving is phenomenal. If you look at digital euro with the ECB, look at Project Tabor in Middle East, Jasper in Canada, what work happening in Australia. So really, if you start connecting the dots, and that's where the Project Dunbar, which Andrew talked about, really becomes key. Really, the whole multi CBDC initiative, and that's what clearly becomes important. Now, zooming into Singapore, clearly the journey started way back in 2016 with Project Ubin. You're again fortunate to really be part of that. It went over 5 different phases, and really it culminated in what we is the setup of the company called Partior, a partnership between DBS, Temasek, and JP Morgan. And really what it does is it leverages on the native strengths of the blockchain. The first and foremost really is programmability, and money today is not programmable, and programmability comes in with smart contracts, and that opens up use cases which are phenomenal. You got traceability, the whole instant settlement and atomic settlement. You got use cases in terms of getting more efficient as the number of hops reduce, and gets more predictability in terms of costs as well as the costs coming down. And it's based on what we call as digitized M1 or commercial bank money. So it really makes money movement or value movement intelligent, faster, cheaper, more efficient. And the use cases, it's actually beyond just payments. So it's offshore payments in Singapore. So today, Singapore, we do Sing dollar clearing within the country. All other payments go into, depending on which currency the payment is denominated in, but this will introduce multi-currency offshore clearing. The next step is cross-border payments, then is conditional payments. Then we've got use cases in trade, DVP for securities, PVP for FX settlement, multi-party escrows, and the good news is this is going live this year. So, watch the space and you'll really see a lot of action on that. The other one you talked about was ISO 20022. I'll just kind of, maybe, that's something Andrew did talk about, but really the key proposition I would say is, the 2 aspects. One is really the migration of the RTGS platforms in the country, to the ISO 20022. Singapore's MEPS Plus goes live like in June 2022. Thailand, Malaysia, all of these are at various stages. And really what it brings to the table is the richer data in a structured format. Now, cross-border payments is the next big leap, and that's a 3-year transition period, starts from November of next year, goes up to November 2025. And if you really look at what it means for customers, is a few things. One, it automates the recon, and gets the recon matching, all of that automated, because you get far richer payment details. From a bank's perspective, you got fewer false positives in terms of screening systems. You get better payment risk modeling, better scoring, better efficiency gains in terms of more straight-through processing, not just for the customers, even for the banks, better data analytics. And at the end, this all translates into cost efficiencies. I'll just pause there.
Thank you, Atul. And before I move on to Venkat, just a quick follow-up question from myself and also from the audience as well. So what is the progress on the joint venture between yourself, Temasek, and JP Morgan Partior? What is the status right now?
So do watch this space in terms of formal announcements. Obviously there is some information in the public domain. Like I mentioned, in terms of pilot flows, do watch out for that starting this year itself. So I think, it's not, while a lot of these other initiatives have been at, I would say, either an evaluation phase or a trial phase, clearly, from a Partior perspective, you will see those announcements coming very soon, and you'll actually see, pilot flows actually starting this year itself. And it's a multi-phase roadmap, which is, I covered a few of those, in terms of across payments effects. So yeah, it is exciting space, and you'll see announcements coming. More announcements coming very soon.
We'll be sure to keep a close eye. And thank you for that rundown on the CDBC space. It's certainly very exciting seeing all the regulators jumping on board with multiple pilots and whatnot. Thanks again, Atul. Let's move on to Venkat. And Venkat, what do you, now, I guess 2 parts question, right? So number 1 is, what do you see as the answer to this problem? And 2, I believe Wise was not really looking at embracing DLT. Has that stance changed? If you would like to comment on that.
Let me start maybe with the second one first.
Sure. Okay.
I think we do keep a close eye on all of the new technologies, whether it's blockchain, crypto, and a lot of the other things that the other speakers talked about. I think the question is, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? At least for us here at Wise, we want to make cross-border payments cheaper, faster, more convenient, and more transparent. I think it's literally to solve the problem that Andrew very eloquently described when he was trying to move money from Canada to Singapore, where we'd love for that money to be able to move instantly. We tell you how much you're going to be charged up front. If, for example, you need a specific amount of money to reach to the other side, we will then tell you how much needs to be paid in on the sending side, and so on and so forth. So our view today is that building on the existing infrastructure out there and making that much more efficient is the fastest and the best way to be able to both lower the cost and to continue to improve the consumer experience. One, but that combined with our own direct connectivity into payment systems around the world, FPS in the UK, fast here in Singapore, and we have aggressive plans for a number of the other payment systems that then allows us to control the entire flow of money end to end across at least all of our major markets. I think, at least for today, is more than adequate to make sure that we're able to offer the lowest price. Our average, I would say, price is about somewhere between 0.6 to 0.7% of the transaction. And of course, that varies from country to country. But I think what we're still proud about it is it's still substantially lower than the global averages that you see from the World Bank and others of about 5 to 6%. And our mission is to make that, of course, eventually free or as cheap as possible. So I think that answers the second question. I think on the first is the things that I've mentioned before. I think continued regulatory push, and I think as Atul mentioned, deregulation to a certain extent, giving fintechs and payment companies the space to grow and be as competitive as the incumbent players in the market. Created digitalization in terms of ease of onboarding for both consumers as well as businesses, and giving us the permission to have a seat at the table and participate directly in these payment systems. I think if we can see more of these happening in the region, and we see them in various stages, if this could all accelerate, I think we will remain one of the preferred ways to be able to move money around the world.
Thank you, Venkat. And certainly you guys have done a lot of great work in this region as well. So what I'm sensing you're saying is that while you guys are keeping a close eye on new technologies like DLT and whatnot, for now you believe the answer still lies within the traditional payment rails to solve some of these problems. All right, thank you for that, Venkat. Let's move on to Eli. Eli, what do you think is the key answers to some of the problems that we see within the cross-border payment space? You have the floor.
All right, I think that's what Atul mentions regarding the CBDC. That's people are needs to build a new way of currency that's to address all the new technology, the blockchains area, as well as the virtual currencies and all the area that we are talking about. And at the same time, is how you provide them on a simple platform for them to come and to use it. I think that's this is one of the keys. How we be able to connect all of them, how they're able to use, how Wise can actually use these type of platforms for them to do it and not building another network. That's what Ripple was trying to build separately, right? How they can use the existing, what we have in right now, and connect between central banks, use other area that they're doing, even to ride on the same platform that Atul is trying to build in here. And in order to use this as his own platform, as a rail to use it. Not necessarily needs to use all the time the SWIFT platform. We see recently that how Visa come up with a Visa B2B platform for them to be able to do cross-border payments in a different way, where they do the FX settlements rather than to do the transactions on a daily basis, what they're doing. And this is another area that's where we can see a new development coming up. So I think that we have quite a lot of new development coming in. I think we need to address is how we be able to connect all of them, that they be able to speak, and not everybody will start to build his own private network for them to do it. In the end of the day, we see a big growth of the e-commerce coming up right now, and that is one of the biggest drivers of the cross-border payment that we can see. We can see that payment move from $130 billion transactions, and probably will move in the next few years to double it and even more for that. So all of this has to become, in a sense, that Wise, DBS, and other will be able to provide the platforms to use it. And we, as a service providers, is the one who connecting all of them to make them, whatever you do in your engines, we be able to format it in the right way. This is where we use our transformation enrichment service that we're having in order for you to come into compliance. to be ready before November 2025, when everybody becomes startups, what we hope everybody will come in time. Everybody should be ready in 2022 in order for them to start the journey and to be able to speak to each other. Otherwise, we will talk different languages and we will not be able to actually to achieve it. So that's where we come in as a service provider to come up with this kind of services.
Thank you for that, Eli. Now, before we move on to the next topic, does anyone else have anything else to add to this particular conversation? No. Okay. So let's move along. So I think we have some questions from the audience over here. Brendan would like to direct this question to Andrew. So Brendan is asking about the protocols for some of these CDBC experiments. Are you able to speak to that, Andrew?
Yeah, so I guess he's asking specifically around public or private DLT protocols. Correct. So yeah, so we are most definitely looking at private DLT protocols, at least on Project Dunbar. The view from the central bank perspective, especially as we contemplate issuing a new liability like a central bank digital currency, that at the very least it's our role to explore and understand the technology as it might pertain to creating this new multi-CDBC network, but doing it in a fully controlled way. That's not to say we aren't willing to work with private sector, in a future state. And in fact, most payment systems, including RTGSs, are public-private partnerships, and from an operational perspective, where the central banks govern and oversee the operations, but aren't necessarily involved in the day-to-day. So we're certainly looking and anticipating, some form of public-private partnership as CDBCs evolve. But the use of a totally public DLT platform like Ethereum is probably a step too far, if only because the governance even of that network causes immediate issues when you step back and look at it, right? These soft forks, hard forks happening actually fairly frequently. I think there was another one on Ethereum 2 weeks ago, would immediately undermine the existence of a central bank issued digital currency and have an unknown effect on monetary policy, to say the least. So we would have to tread very, very cautiously in terms of using a public blockchain like an Ethereum platform. Not to say there isn't a lot of interesting innovation and work happening in that space, but it doesn't seem a good fit for certainly a wholesale CDBC like what we're talking about, or likely even a retail CDBC as well.
Thank you, Andrew. Before we move on to the next topic, I think Atul, CDBC is something, and also digital currencies, all these sort of things are something that you spend a lot of time looking at, right? Do you want to add anything to this conversation about public or private protocols, or shall we move on to the next question? No? All good. Okay, so yes, would you like to add something, Atul?
No, I'm just trying to unmute. No, all good. Andrew said it all, and clearly, I think the whole permission access, makes it simpler, and the way we look at it, that's it's an evolution, it's a journey. So we start with this phase and see how the roadmap maps out.
All right, perfect. So my next question is actually directed at Venkat, and I think for the longest time, if we look at a lot of fintech startups that are focused on cross-border payments, the market that they typically try to attack is the consumers market, right? And largely, if you look at cross-border payments for large wholesale customers, that's still a territory where banks are still quite strong at. And do you see a future where startups like yourself, well, I don't know if you can still call you a startup now that you are listed in the London Stock Exchange, but do you see fintech operators like yourself kind of taking a bigger chunk of this pie?
You're right, Vincent. I sometimes also struggle with what is the right term to call wise. We're now 10 million customers strong, 10 years old as a company, and very privileged to be listed on the London Stock Exchange. Sorry, Vincent, could you just repeat again the question?
So whether or not you see that a future where fintech operators like
On
Wise
wholesale
take a bigger
payments, yes.
on no on the more like the wholesale customers, the larger corporate clients.
Got it. Uh, so I think the answer is yes, but the answer is also it's not happening overnight. There is a lot of infrastructure that even for us as a 10-year-old company need to continue to focus building around the world, and we're absolutely focused on that. So I think that will sort of remain the priority for us. What we are seeing though is certain types of large customers, if you will, are now beginning to see the value of the Wise infrastructure. So today, a number of digital banks and a growing number of incumbent banks as well use Wise's infrastructure to power cross-border remittances for their own customers. So you have Aspire here, which is an up-and-coming lender. We have Shinhan in Korea, which is a legacy institution, and they've both found value in using our infrastructure and our pricing to be able to offer a better solution to their customers. When we look at small and medium-sized businesses, we have something like 300,000 plus businesses using us around the world, and maybe 150,000 businesses adding to us each year. So the journey is definitely there, and I think the challenge remains for companies like us to continue to find the pain points for those wholesale payments and to continue to solve for them.
All right, thank you for that. So we've unfortunately run a little bit low on time, only about 10 more minutes left. So maybe we'll move on to some closing thoughts. Maybe we can go with Atul, Andrew, Eli, and then back to Venkat. Atul, why don't you share with us what your thoughts are on how this space will evolve in the medium to long term, and how incumbents like yourself, what kind of initiatives you can take to remain competitive in this space?
Sure. So we've talked about how payments is rapidly transforming. We've talked about how it's no longer the so-called plumbing of the market or the global commerce. It's really now center stage in terms of also becoming a builder of competitive advantage for businesses. So the efficiencies, reducing costs are all vital. The speed is important, but what we increasingly see is how payments are actually becoming a tool for our customers to really be able to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And clearly the whole 3I, the instant, integrated, intelligent payments helps to make this real. So a couple of, maybe a couple of different dimensions, if I were to maybe kind of look ahead. So one really is, the whole, the digital life cycle, for want of a better word, has a couple of different stages. Obviously, it starts with the physical, then you've got the phygital business models, which is part physical, part digital. Then you've got the third one, which would be the digital ready, which is where I think a lot of participants in the financial ecosystem or even in the the value chain would be. The next really is about moving into digital first, and then eventually is about digital only, which is the whole digital native, whether you call it Gen Z or whichever the latest generation after that is. So it's important to really be able to understand where different participants are across this so-called life cycle, across these maybe 5 different stages, and really to be able to facilitate that movement across and that's something which with COVID and with national priorities and so on and so forth has become center stage. So it is I would say the world of hyper digitalization in terms of this life cycle. The second aspect really would be around maybe an element of what we call as maybe the hyper connectivity, leveraging on the intelligent devices, the 5G, IoT, and edge computing, and really that's where we've just touched the tip of the iceberg and the possibilities really in terms of use cases, whether it's let's say smart refrigerators, whether it's about getting automobile financing for car dealers based on with chips in the car on where the car is, checking in terms of commodities and warehouses, and so again the possibilities I can go on and on. And it's also about making embedded payments. At the end of the day, very few of us get out of bed wanting to make a payment. At the end of the day, it should be invisible. So if I have information on the customer's ERP that they've procured, let's say a certain goods, and the payment would be made 30 days later, based on which corridor, which currency, can I auto execute that even without the customer really having to worry much about it. And then really the final one I would say really is about the convergence, and this convergence, and we talked about really between the cross-border and the domestic instant schemes, which is now starting to gather momentum. It's also about convergence across the rest of the facets of the economy, whether it's payments linked to FX, payments linked to trade, security, supply chain. At the end of the day, the way we look at it is these are all, payments becomes a Lego building block, and these Lego building blocks really, get to solve each of these, facets typically which comes in. And I'll just end up, typically saying that, yeah, it's these challenging times like COVID, which really are great tests, in terms of our financial ecosystem players. As they say, a ship is not really made for, the calm waters of the harbor. A ship is really made for rough seas and, going to new horizons. And that's what makes great captains. You don't become a great captain sitting in the harbor. So really it's the, it's really, what we see is the flight to safety and the flight to digital, which is really what, these extraordinary times really facilitate. Back to you, Vincent.
Thank you, Atul. We can always count on you on the wise sayings. So, thank you for all this.
You mean no
Venkat-
pun intended? No pun intended, Vincent.
Maybe
should not
only
take over.
slightly. All right, thank you for that. So let's move on to Andrew. Andrew, what are your closing thoughts? How do you see this space evolving in the medium to long term?
Wow, Atul is a tough act to follow, but I guess from our perspective, we see a lot of opportunity space innovating within the traditional rails. We've talked about innovation within the next generation central bank digital currencies. We do see a coexistence, and ultimately, like, what are we trying to accomplish? And certainly from the BIS perspective, we do support the sustainable development goals that would be to lower the cost to less than 3% for a cross-border payment. And certainly some institutions can already do that, which is fantastic. But very much aligned with those types of goals and all of the World Bank research and kind of the overall kind of vision for remittance and cross-border payment opportunities. Again, we do think that interconnecting fast payments infrastructure is a key part of that storyline. And I think, Ven has covered off kind of the value to Wise in terms of being a direct participant in fast payment infrastructures and what that has meant to your business. We see instant payments as being the backbone for domestic and cross-border payments in the future. As well, I guess, financial inclusion is a key topic as well. And if we think about, certainly what some of those issues are, it's actually just getting more people access to bank accounts or regulated payment wallets. And so I think that's an important step. I mean, if we have all of this wonderful infrastructure in place, but nobody, a significant number of people can't use it or access it because of, EKYC or other barriers to entry. I think India has done an amazing job of, including hundreds of millions of people into the banking system, albeit even a light touch, but they were able to do it. And I think that those are tremendous improvements that we would like to see, propagated around the world.
Thank you, Andrew. You've given us a lot to think about. You managed to follow Atul's act perfectly, so no worries. Moving on to Eli. Eli, what are your closing thoughts for us, and how do you see this space evolving in the medium to long term?
So first of all, we're sitting in a panel here in the 4 different angles of the cross-border payments. We see the bank, we see Wise, we see BIC. I think this is and of course, Bottomline is as a service provider. We see a lot of changes happening, and we cannot ignore that. We cannot be sustain what it was before. There is a lot of dynamic that's happening, and we need to come in to address different angle of this cross-border payment that we need to do for different participants, either for the retail peoples, or for the corporate side, or for the banking side. Different corridors in Asia with different currency that we need to come in to address this type of issues. Not one size fits all. And I think that whatever each one of us is sitting is to address a certain area. I think more Andrew was talking about more about the digital type of it, and Atul is trying to address additional services to his customers and coming up. And where Bottomline is coming is trying how we be able to provide the services to all different players in order for them to participate and play with that one, rather than to build them themselves. And also, don't forget, there are smaller banks, not as large and innovating like DBS. There are smaller banks what we call it tier 2, tier 3 banks that wants to play in these type of things and needs to be giving them the opportunity to be able to connect to various networks to come up. So I think the new cross-border payment is changing. It's here to continue. Are things that we need to address. That's going to be multiple networks coming up, multiple way of doing the cross-border payment, and we cannot stay only one with the SWIFT connectivity in one hand. The thing to do. There are challenges, but I think if we be able to come to address it locally, and then regionally, and then globally, I think we'll be able to come up with this kind of service to provide.
Thank you for that, Eli. So let's move on to Venkat. Venkat, what is your closing thoughts and your, kind of views on how you see this space evolving from the medium to long term?
So conscious of time, so my quick response here really is we need more consumer education as well. Andrew was able to figure out that it cost him $40. I would love to ask him what the actual exchange rate that he was charged when he moved money from Canada to Singapore. I think many people here, including well-educated people, trust their legacy institution, but don't realize that they're probably not getting the best exchange rate and they're being charged a transaction rate that is probably much more expensive. And even in very competitive markets, people don't realize that there could be better options to do that. So for us here at Wise, that's an area that we spend a lot of time on. And we would love to see other institutions, even those that are here on this panel, to do more in that front, to focus on that transparency.
Thank you for that, Venkat. I certainly appreciated all the views that were brought in by the panelists. Very diverse, from an incumbent, from a startup, from a technology provider, and from an agency like BIS, which is doing a lot of interesting work around this space. Talking about CDBC, the traditional payment rails. I hope everybody enjoyed the session as much as I did. Certainly learned a lot. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Over 200 of you, and all the panelists for really sharing their insights with us. I hope you guys have a good afternoon. Take care and see you all next time.